Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Med School Mondays with Promo. I am Promo, aka Professor Mohan. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about an introduction to the cortisol hormone. Cortisol, we're going to talk about the physiology, some of the functions, and of course, definitely going to tell you about the source of cortisol. Again, if you missed any of the previous lectures from the last few weeks, you know what to do. Click on the links below and you'll go back to the previous video. You guys got it now. You guys got it. So anyways, like we want to say, Cortisol, how is it produced? How is it released? We want to introduce to you guys this gland called the adrenal gland. So there's two adrenal glands, of course, located above the kidneys. How does this all work? Again, right back to the basics. The hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called the Corticotropin-releasing hormone. That's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, which will release ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone. Okay? That will stimulate this adrenal gland. Now, adrenal gland is broken down into two main compartments, the cortex and the medulla. For the purposes of today's lecture, we're going to introduce more of the cortex to you. But what you do want to know is that the inner portion is the medulla. It's going to release hormones such as norepinephrine and epinephrine, which we'll discuss in a future lecture. Today's lecture, we're going to talk about the cortex, the surrounding area. The cortex is now broken down into three main components as well: the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. So we refer to it that as GFR. From outside to inside, GFR. Today, like again, we're just focusing on the cortisol. So the main source of cortisol production and release is the zona fasciculata, this F portion right over here. Once I get this marker open, there we go. Once cortisol is released, as you can see, there's a little bit of a feedback inhibition going on. As cortisol production increases, it's going to inhibit its own production by inhibiting the anterior pituitary gland, as well as inhibiting the hypothalamus. You also want to know is when cortisol how does it work on its receptors? The signaling pathway for cortisol is the intracellular receptor. Okay, so don't forget that. One last thing you want to remember for the regulation of cortisol: chronic stress. When a patient is undergoing lots of stress, that's also going to stimulate the hypothalamus. That's also going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland. So that's going to produce more and more cortisol. Now, why is cortisol bad? Well, it's a stress hormone. It causes stress in the body. So let's look at this side of the board, and I will move on this side of the board. So some of the functions of cortisol. What happens when we have too much cortisol? Or just in general, what happens when we have cortisol? So on the left column over here, I broke it down into, well, cortisol increases a few things in the body. And on the right side, I'm saying over here, cortisol decreases a few things in the body. So let's start over here on the left. Increases blood pressure. How does it do that? It upregulates the alpha-1 receptors on arterioles. So when the medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, guess what? The arterioles are going to be extra sensitive. So of course, blood pressure is going to increase. Good. It's going to increase gluconeogenesis, so more glucose in the blood. Increase lipolysis, break down lots of fats. Increase proteolysis, that's not a good thing either, right? It's going to break down muscle mass. So all these negative effects are going on just with too much cortisol. And the third one over here increases insulin resistance. So of course the patient is going to look like a diabetic, which is not a good thing at all. What does it do on the other side? It decreases bone formation. So it's increasing osteoblastic activity. That's not good for the body. The patient's going to have a weak bone, broken bone as they get older. Not good at all. It's going to decrease fibroblastic activity. So if you decrease the fibroblastic activity, a patient will present with stria. Stria is those purple lines around the patient's abdomen. You'll see that in Cushing's syndrome as well as Cushing's disease. And lastly, it decreases inflammatory and immune response. So of course, you can expect the patient to get more ill, more sick, not being able to fight infections, all the bad stuff. So just remember, remind yourselves that cortisol is a stress hormone and it does all these negative effects by decreasing these things on the right and increasing these things on the left. Okay, now that was it. Today's just a quick little introduction to the cortisol. We mentioned the regulation, the functions, and of course the source. Next week, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about, well, what happens when we have too much cortisol. That's referred to as hypercortisolism. And specifically, we talk about Cushing's disease as well as Cushing's syndrome. In the meantime, what you guys got to do, you guys got to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video with all your friends, and definitely comment on the sections below. Let your friends know that, hey, this is the place to learn about cortisol. Until then, I want you guys to have a great week. We will see you next week on Med School Mondays with Promo.